The bad news is that there's almost no progress in closing the life expectancy gap between Aboriginal and other Australians, which is still about a decade. There's been very little improvement towards halving the gap in reading, writing and numeracy. And Indigenous employment, I deeply regret to say, has, if anything, slipped backwards over the past few years. So, Madam Speaker, we are not on track to achieve the more important and the more meaningful targets. Because it's hard to be literate and numerate without attending school. It's hard to find work without a basic education, and it's hard to live well without a job. We are all passionate to close the gap. But we may, I fear, be doomed to fail until we achieve the most basic target of all, the expectation that every child will attend school every day. Now, generally speaking, the more remote the school, the more excuses are made for poor attendance. Last year, in metropolitan areas, only 81% of Indigenous Year 9 students met the national minimum standards for reading. But in very remote areas, just 31% of Indigenous students reached the same minimum standard. Yet it is being demonstrated in places like Arakoon that a strong education in traditional culture is actually helped by a good education in English. Right around our country, it should be possible to be proudly Aboriginal and a full participant in modern Australia. That doesn't just mean access to a good education in cities, towns and remote settlements. It means actually going to school. So, Madam Speaker, I propose to add a new target to our existing Closing the Gap targets, namely to end the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous school attendance within 5 years. Yeah. And, Madam Speaker, I hope I am here long enough to be judged on its achievement. We will know that this gap has been all but closed when schools achieve 90% plus attendance regardless of their percentage of Aboriginal students. Madam Speaker, this was the strong consensus of my Indigenous Advisory Council's first meeting, that no one ever received a good education by not going to school. Every day, in every school, the roll is taken. Every school knows its attendance rates. Every education department knows the attendance rate for every school. And the lower the attendance rate, the more likely it is that a school has problems. The lower the attendance rate, the more likely it is that a school is failing its students. It's the duty of every teacher and every education department to try to ensure that every child attends school unless there's a very good reason. Because one of the worst forms of neglect is failing to give children the education they need for a decent life. That's why every state and territory has anti-truancy laws. That's why the former government in this place, to its credit, tried to quarantine welfare payments for families whose children weren't at school. And that's why, at my first COAG meeting, every state and territory agreed with the Commonwealth on the need to publish attendance data for every school. And that's why, at 40 remote schools, the Commonwealth is already funding new anti-truancy measures that on day one of the 2014 school year in some communities seem to have boosted attendance from under 60% to over 90%. Our job is to break the tyranny of low expectations. That's why Indigenous school attendance data will be part of the next Closing the Gap report and of all subsequent reports under this government. This Parliament will be brought up to date on the relative success or failure of Aboriginal education because, Madam Speaker, a good education is fundamental to a good start in life. Future Closing the Gap reports should also include data on work program participation and data on communities without a police presence. These reports, after all, should be less about what government is doing and more about how people are living. We will know that Aboriginal people are living better when children go to school, when adults go to work, and when the ordinary law of the land is respected and enforced. Madam Speaker, the first Aboriginal member of this Parliament, Senator Neville Bonner, once warned his colleagues that history would judge us all. Well, Madam Speaker, we should not have to wait for the judgment of history. And thanks to these Closing the Gap statements, we don't have to. A fair go for Aboriginal people is far too important to be put off to the judgment of history. We have to provide it now, or as soon as we reasonably can. And I am confident of this. Amidst all the mistakes, amidst all the disappointments, and amidst all the uncertain starts that we have made, the one failure that we have mostly avoided is lack of goodwill. It's the one failure we've mostly avoided. And Australians are now as proud of our indigenous heritage as we are of all our other traditions. The challenge is to turn good intentions into better outcomes. I am confident that in these days at least, for every one step backwards, we are also taking 2 steps forward. To give just one example, on every ministerial visit to the APY lands, I used to complain bitterly that there were just 8 police for 3,000 people spread over an area the size of Scotland, and that none of these police lived in any of the places where they were needed. Well, 6 years later, I have to admit these are hardly model communities, but every substantial settlement has a permanent police presence thanks to the good work of the South Australian Labor government, because this, Madam Speaker, was an objective beyond politics. As Fred Chaney has just said, reflecting on a lifetime of work with Aboriginal people, there is so much left to do. But in this area, these really are the best of times. There is probably no aspect of public policy on which there is more unity of purpose and readiness to give others the benefit of the doubt. On this subject, at least, our Parliament is at its best. And our duty, Madam Speaker, is to make the most of this precious moment. And, Madam Speaker, I tabled the Closing the Gap statement.